Hello everybody, my name is Raja Gopal and I am going to introduce you to a number of notions, ideas related to bilingualism and multilingualism and the teaching of languages and other subjects in our Indian classrooms through these 5 lectures. These have been specially brought to you by NCERT, and we shall, during the course of these 5 lectures, try and understand a number of concepts, a number of ideas, many definitions, examples. Now, we shall look into all these so that by the end of this series, you shall have a fair idea concerning bilingualism, multilingualism, their role in India, their role in our classrooms, and so on and so forth. And so, in these sessions, 5 sessions, we shall focus on a number of concepts which are related to language. Language in use, both by the individual and in society and elsewhere. We shall also talk a little bit about language learning. How does one learn and use more than one language, many languages for that matter? We shall look into that also. Now, all these will be related to what happens in the Indian classrooms. How do our learners learn? Who are our learners? Where do they come from? What language background do they come from? And so on and so forth. Now, we shall also understand how some of these issues in our classrooms, language related issues, could be tackled by us teachers. Basically, this series is meant for teachers, you and me, and it also should interest teacher trainers, trainers, and those who are involved in syllabus construction, for example, curriculum framing, and maybe to some extent those who are involved in textbooks production. And there are many amongst you who will be involved in preparing tests, assessment, and so on. And so anybody who is interested in knowing a few things related to language, languages, and how they function, and so on and so forth, these series will be of extreme interest to them. Now, you should also know that we are going to introduce ourselves to a number of concepts, theoretical concepts. We will know what many people have thought, researched on in these subjects. What has been the outcome of this research? What could be some of those plans of action? Such as, for example, what could be some of those courses, curricula, types, and so on and so forth. So we are going to learn quite a lot of things. I will not take you to very high level thinking and research and so on, but I will take you through some of those basics. If you are all ready, let us start now. To begin with, you can see the visual behind you. The major areas that we are going to focus on would be an introduction to bilingualism, multilingualism, and some of the basic concepts related to what we call L1 and L2. This is what we are going to look into today in this lecture. And then we are moving into a second topic, which would be some of those features of bilingualism and multilingualism and some related basic notions. That would be lecture number 2. Lecture number 3, as you can see there, is on something called code switching and code mixing. These are concepts which you should know, and code mixing, code switching and language use by the bilinguals is what we are going to look at in lecture number 3. And then at lecture number 4, we will be defining a bilingual. We will see how a bilingual has been defined by many people, researchers, thinkers and others, and how can we define an Indian bilingual. Okay, this will be the focus of attention in lecture number 4. And lastly, in the 5th and final lecture, we shall look at teaching of languages in our country. What are some of those issues? And when we move into our context, we shall also talk briefly about how mother tongue can be utilized in our Indian classrooms. In other words, these are the 5 major topics we will be discussing in these 5 sessions, as you can see there. And so, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I would like all of you to be ready with your notes, notebooks, pens, pencils, and keep ready. And we are going to begin now. Shall we start? Yeah, we shall. Okay. First and foremost, bilingualism and multilingualism are talked as synonyms. There is no difference made between bilinguals and multilinguals. When we say bilinguals, we mean multilinguals, and so on and so forth. Bilingual, trilingual, whatever number it could be, but they are all similar. So I shall keep on using the term bilinguals, and wherever necessary, I will use the term multilinguals. Now, first point that you should know is bilingual or bilingualism of philosophy or multilingualism of philosophy are basically an individual phenomenon, and at the same time it is a social or societal phenomenon. Societal refers to society, a phenomenon which occurs in society. And so we have bilingualism, and when we talk of bilingualism, we mean an individual's bilingualism as well as a society's bilingualism. So it exists in both these factors and features and so on. So the individual as well as the society. This is the first one that you should know about. Next, bilingualism, multilingualism is a very vast subject. A lot of research has gone on in this, and for centuries, ever since societies started inviting people from other places, and when people came into societies, they also brought their languages with them, you see. So perhaps a society which was always monolingual, that is, using only one language, becomes a multilingual society the moment different people enter this society with different languages. you see. So, when people come into a society, you can look all around you, all over, even in our country also, when different language speaking people converge into a society, a group, it could be whatever, housing society, or it could be a town, and so on and so forth, a nation. That society, which was monolingual so far, becomes multilingual now. Now, this phenomenon of people or society becoming multilingual has been a subject of study for many, many years. And therefore, we have lots of these concepts which are very relevant for us, which are very relevant for you and me, coming into the notion of bilingualism and multilingualism. Now, therefore, any number of concepts, any number of descriptions, any number of definitions, all these have become possible now, and today they are all available to us, and we shall examine quite a number of them now. Now, for us teachers, it's very important to understand the place where we teach. What kind of a society is it? What kind of members are there in that society? What do we mean by that? For example, if I am teaching in a school, I should know where my school is located. What is its environment like? What is there in its surroundings? Who have joined our school? Where are they from? What language or languages do they bring into it? What is the school's language? What is the language I use to teach? What is my own language? And so on, see? So, as teachers, when we think of multilingualism, ladies and gentlemen, understand this very well. We have to look into ourselves as well as look out at our environment in order to understand what languages exist all around us. This is the study of bilingualism and multilingualism, which you are going to undertake now. And so, it becomes very important that whatever happens inside the classroom and whatever happens outside the classroom become equally important for us teachers. And in our country, this is absolutely fabulous. This is phenomenal. This is most challenging, and therefore, you have to be up to it. And so, we are talking about some of these things and so on. Now, it's equally important for us, those of us who prepare textbooks. You see? Now, textbook construction is an extremely important activity, curricular activity, which means that, you see, those who prepare textbooks have to be specialists in not just the structure, the format of a textbook, but also the language that goes into the textbook. They have to have a certain control over that language. Now, what control will they have? How will they have it? How do they bring in a controlled language into the textbooks? And so, those who prepare textbooks are also equally responsible to understand language systems, bilingualism, multilingualism, and whatever it is, whatever other phenomena exists around them, surrounding them, and so on. Thirdly, apart from teachers and textbook writers, we also have a number of people who prepare tests, assessment systems. Now, these are also equally important people. How do they construct the tests? What language do they use there? How will they control the language of the tests? Supposing language becomes too difficult for the learners, it's a problem. And so, controlling the language in accordance with the kind of language or languages that survive around them is again the responsibility of the test constructor, one who assesses performance and so on and so forth. So, it is very important for them also, and it is also equally important for the administrator. Imagine you as the principal of the school. What is the school's language? Is it monolingual? Is it bilingual? Is it multilingual? How do you accommodate them? How do you control your admissions? What criterion do you use? What message will you give as the headmaster or headmistress to the rest of the teachers about how they should perform and so on, you see? So, for an administrator also it becomes a very crucial thing. And then of course, there can be higher level administrators, state level administrators, policy makers, a number of these things. And so, in other words, when we think of bilingualism, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude this part, we say that bilingualism or multilingualism is a phenomenon which begins with the learner and goes up into the higher levels, to the highest level, which will be the national policy, you see. And so, bilingualism in this matter, multilingualism from these perspectives is very much a classroom subject, a state level subject, a national subject, and so on and so forth. So, it becomes extremely important for us to understand some of these things. Okay. Having understood this basic, we will now move into a little further and try and understand a few terms, terminology, concepts, and this is the step where we begin to look into individual things, and so you have to be very careful in your note making. The first concept we are going to look at is what we call L1 and L2. Now, L1 in teaching can stand for the first language or the mother tongue, and L2 for the other language which is different from the first language. But one thing that all of you must remember is we cannot use all these terms very loosely when we talk of bilingualism and multilingualism, because these terms L1, L2 for example are all heavily loaded terms, and they mean different things in different contexts, and they mean quite a lot, quite a number. And therefore, for example, when we think of L1 in bilingualism and multilingualism, we not only mean mother tongue. That means, what do we mean by mother tongue? The first language of communication for the child is supposed to be with mother when the child is on the mother's lap, and that language which mother uses and the child responds to is what is known as mother tongue. Tongue here means language, the language of communication. And so, L1 in bilingualism also means mother tongue, but it means quite a few other things as well. We talk of in bilingualism, first language, mother tongue, native language, primary language, stronger language, dominant language. You see, in bilingualism and multilingualism in this field, L1 can mean many things other than just mother tongue alone. I am sure you understand that. Native language, the language that belongs to me, because I belong to that language group. Primary language, in my group I may have many languages, but what I call primary language, my first language, could be my L1. Stronger language, well, you see, it's not exactly my mother tongue, but this is my stronger language, which could even be English for some people. They may not know their mother tongue, but they may know other tongues. Could be Hindi, could be English, could be whatever else, French, Spanish, anything. And so, my stronger language, my dominant language. So, the moment I want to speak, this is the language that comes to my brain. Perhaps I also dream in this language, I don't know. But dominant language. And so all these are the different definitions for L1. Why am I talking about this, ladies and gentlemen? As teachers, you must now remember that L1 can mean many things in the field of bilingualism and multilingualism. And similarly, L2. Now, L2 normally we define as any language which is not my L1 is my L2. I will repeat it. Know this very well. L2 or second language is any language which is not my L1. So, all languages which are not related to my L1, which is not my L1, shall become L2 or second language. This is the normal definition of L2. L1 first language or mother tongue, L2 any language which is not my mother tongue or first language, L1 is my L2. But in bilingualism and multilingualism, and when we talk of the field called bilingualism and multilingualism, it could be, in addition to second language, L2, could be what we may call non-native language. So, it is not my native language, it is my non-native language. It could also be foreign language, which is not my national language, not the language in my country, but totally foreign to me. And so, second language could be foreign language in addition to non-native language. It could be all other tongues. By tongue, we don't mean not that, but we mean language. So, all other languages will be classified under L2 in bilingualism, multilingualism. It could be a secondary language. Remember, when we talked of L1, we talked of primary language. So, in bilingualism, multilingualism literature, L2 is referred to as secondary language. I can use this, I can use that also. But first, I use that, which I call my L1, and then I use this one also as secondary language. Next, after a little bit of thinking and so on. And in bilingualism, we also talk of what is called weaker language. My L1 is my stronger language, whereas my L2 would be my weaker language. I am sure you can think of several examples for all these things. Okay. Now, you can see all these represented in the visual in front of you now. Okay. Moving further, sometimes L1 and L2 are also used differently. Not just, we said bilingualism, multilingualism is an individual as well as a societal phenomenon. We have already said that. How do we mean now? So far we talked of an individual's L1 and L2. Now we are moving one step further into societal features. And so, when we talk of societal features, L1 and L2 could depend on the geographical location of a place. So, if you are somewhere there in Madhya Pradesh or somewhere, there L1 could be something else and so L2 could be something else. If you are with Santalis, for example, Santali could be L1 and all languages could be L2. and my language is not Santali, and so for me that is the issue, that I have to look at the L1 in this location, geographical location, or in Kashmir, or in Kerala, or Odia, or Bengal, and so the geographical location will determine what is L1 and what are the L2s. You see, that's so complex, the geographical distribution of a language depending on the location. L1 and L2 could also depend on social functions. What do we mean by that? In a certain society, when a certain event is going on, the L1 there could be very different from the L2. For example, if you are looking at a court, law court, the language there is something totally different. And if you want to function in the courts, you have to get into that language, and that language becomes the L1 in that context. Do you understand? If you go into a hotel and go into the kitchen of a hotel where the chefs are working and so on, their language will become the L1 there, and all other languages will become L2. You see, this is how geographical locations define language. In a classroom, in your classroom, for example, the classroom language, the language that is used inside the classroom is L1. All other languages are L2. Classroom L1 may not be my L1 or others L1, but that is the classroom L1. Now, the place where language is being used, that also determines what is L1 and L2. I gave you the example of a court. Similarly, for example, if you are working in an IT company, in the IT company there is a different language, and that is the language of the IT company. If you go into an office, the office language becomes L1 and all other languages become L2, and so whatever language I might know, I will have to learn that office language, and that becomes the L1 so long as I am inside the office or inside the IT office. If you are in the railway station, there is a different language there. And so every social context, every social event will have their own L1, their own L2, L3, L4, L5 and so on and so forth. So this is how the societal features of L1 and L2, definition of L1 and L2, become very important. Similarly, we also talk of another term, which is majority language and minority language. In a society, there can be a majority language, and there can be a number of minority languages, or maybe more than one majority language, we do not know. But majority language, and I am sure you can now begin to see how all these words and terms become very important. And lastly, here in the societal context, we also talk of what is called language of wider communication. So if you are in a mela, the language of wider communication in the mela could be something, and that is the L1 of that mela. Whatever could be the others' languages, whatever could be even that seller's language, but the mela will have one language which is very prominent, and that is the L1 of that mela. All other languages become L2. And so you see, there is no single definition of L1 and L2 as far as bilingualism and multilingualism are concerned. Now, all of you are aware that according to the Constitution, Indian Constitution for example, we have a national language, we have official language, we have an associate official language, we have a state language, we have a minority language. We have so many other classifications. I am not going to explain all those things. You should know about these things, and you know about some of these things and so on. The Constitution also talks of classical language, which sometimes it is referred to as heritage language or heritage languages. classical languages, and so on. So this is the constitutional definition of different languages, the status of different languages. So we have seen the individual definitions, we have seen the societal definitions, we have also seen the constitutional definition of language and languages. Now, all of you are aware, in a similar manner, you are also aware of, for example, there are major and important differences between rural languages, urban languages, tribal languages, the marginalized communities and their languages. In other words, when we talk of bilingualism and multilingualism, we also pay attention to some of these languages which exist in different clusters of societies. And so when we study in this field of bilingualism and multilingualism, and in particular the way language functions, we also study how they function in various social contexts, which I have referred to just now. So when we think of an individual's language, for example, this is very interesting. All of us, depending on where we are at this moment, who we are talking to, who we are interacting with, and so on, our own language, our own languages, even our own mother tongues vary. They differ from situation to situation, person to person, people to people. The way I talk to my father or my grandmother is very different from the way I talk to the principal of my school, or the way I talk to somebody else, or whoever I meet on the street, the way I talk to a politician, for example, and so on and so forth. So an individual also has several languages. So not just one language. And these languages which are there in us become operative. They become used depending on the situation. I may speak whatever language, but when I go into the classroom, I speak a particular type of language. I do that. I use it. And the moment I have to report something to my principal or to my colleagues in the staff room, I use a different language. And the moment I want to talk to the parents in parent teaching meeting, that's a different language I use, isn't it? Doesn't it happen like that? And therefore, you see, the phenomenon called multilingualism becomes extremely complex. Where do you locate? But you should be able to say that this is the language that is functioning at this point of time, in this context, because of these reasons, and so on and so forth. And that's very important. So that's how you also become very sensitive to bilingualism and multilingualism, which is what I want you to become. So there are many ways in which a language is looked upon in society and by the individual and so on. Now, lastly, I want to conclude, a child's L1 or mother tongue can change. It need not be the first language that the mother and the child spoke. As the child grows up, depending on the environment and so on, the child's language can change. It can change far away from what the mother tongue was when the child was born and when mother and child spoke. And so a child's language also can change. And so gradually our languages change and we learn new L1s as we go along. If you are living in a certain society where a certain language has to be used, you will learn it. You may be speaking Arabic, but when you come to a market where the local language is spoken, you have to learn that language. And so you have to change. All of us have to change. And that's very, very important. So, lastly, in our country, languages are given academic status as well as administrative status. So, What is the type of language that is there in our country? We will learn that in a short while in some detail and so on. So, to conclude, a bilingual or multilingual or multilingual approach to L1 and L2 will be far different from either the state's approach of first language, second language, third language, or the individual's approach of L1 and L2, or the society's approach of L1, L2, and so on and so forth, and therefore it can change. It can change from an individual's point of view, it can change from a society's point of view. A society which was monolingual once can now become bilingual, can become multilingual, and so on and so forth. And so, for teachers also, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of L1 and L2 will be very different, because lastly, when you talk of medium of instruction, whatever your L1 is, you have to shift to that medium of instruction. The individual learner also, whatever his or her language be, has to shift to the medium of instruction. And so, the medium of instruction becomes the language of instruction, and therefore, bilingualism, multilingualism will become significant there also. Fine. We shall now move into the second session, where we will talk a little more about individuals, bilingualism, and things like this, and we will try and understand a few basic notions there. Thank you very much.